Hello there. Welcome to tonight's channel where together we open the door to the past, touching stories so real you can almost smell, hear, and feel them. Tonight, we're not talking about wars or kings, but something much closer smell. The smell of medieval people, in a time when bathing wasn't something everyone dared to do. Before we begin this journey, if you truly enjoy these chilling yet honest adventures, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any story. And if you're watching right now, drop a comment below and tell me where you are and what time it is. I want to know if you're hearing this story in the darkness of night or in the calm of the afternoon. Now, dim the lights around you, pull up your blanket, or lean back in your chair. Loosen your shoulders, take a slow breath. Because from this moment on, you won't just hear a story, you'll live inside it. Today, we're not talking about knights or dragons, but about smell. The smell of medieval people. A topic no one mentions in stories of grand castles or lavish feasts, yet it's the truth that lingers in every breath, every corner of the past. Because behind those cold stone walls, behind the shining armor and solemn religious rituals, people still lived, and they lived in smell. Not the pure fragrance of flowers, or the pleasant scent of candle wax that movies portray. It was the smell of sweat, of unwashed skin for months, of clothes soaked with smoke and ash, of straw, livestock, and the slow rot of time. If you close your eyes and imagine, you can smell it, a scent both alive and dead, both human and wild. Medieval people didn't know soap like we do, had no showers, no warm water flowing from a tap. They were born, grew up, fell in love, and died in a world where clean was a luxury. So instead of telling you about glorious victories or bloody battles, tonight I'll tell you about something simpler, the breath of everyday life, the thing history often hides behind layers of modern perfume. You'll see. Not everyone was filthy out of laziness, but because a whole society had turned bathing into something frightening. There were those who believed water opened the door to disease. That body heat was their only wall against the poisoned air outside. There were nobles who bathed in milk and roses, while peasants knew only vinegar and ash. And you'll see, beneath every layer of dust and sweat, there was still a heartbeat, still warmth, real, imperfect human beings you could almost smell. The history we're about to enter isn't fragrant like books or glittering like legends. It's heavy, damp, and full of human breath. When we say the medieval smell, we're talking about a language of memory, something no document could ever capture. Only the senses can. It's the smell of wool blankets unwashed through winter, of a blacksmith's hands, of kitchen smoke clinging to hair, of salted meat and dying candles. That smell clung to everything, walls, tables, beds, even dreams. You might think, just bathe and it's gone. But to medieval people, bathing wasn't simply cleaning. It was an act of risk, like opening a window during a plague. They believed water could bring sickness, that steam weakened the body, that the soul was endangered each time bare skin touched cold water. It wasn't just physical filth, it was fear woven into faith. So don't rush to judge them. When you live in a world without germs, where medicine and religion intertwine, you'd believe the same. And so instead of bathing, people found countless ways to live with their own scent. They learned to accept it, even to take pride in it. Because smell wasn't just something on the skin, it was a sign of class, of identity. A poor man smelled of sweat, a noble smelled of perfume. Each had their own scent, and neither felt shame. In truth, if there's one thing that makes medieval people different from us, it's that they never tried to escape nature. They lived in smell, with smell, and by smell. Tonight, you'll step into that world with me where every breath tells a story, where every layer of dust on a cloak is a witness of time. You'll see a world both strange and familiar, where people weren't so different from us, only that they hadn't yet invented ways to hide themselves. So hold your breath, open your imagination, and remember, what we're about to tell isn't for mockery, but for understanding. To understand that within the filth there was still faith, within the stench there was still love, within the ashes there was still the light of humanity. This isn't a story of decay, it's a story of survival. A world where scent was a language, where body and soul were bound together by smoke, sweat, and belief. And by the end you might realize, we, the ones who bathe daily, spray perfume, and wash with artificial flowers, may have lost something deeply human that they once had. A true smell. a trace of life unfiltered by chemicals or fear. So tonight, don't hold your breath. Let yourself smell history, because only when we accept the odor of the past can we truly understand the breath of humanity in that age. Imagine waking up in a village in the year 1348. No shower, no soap, no concept of clean smell like the one you're used to. You open your eyes, and the first thing that greets you isn't soft light or the aroma of morning coffee, but a thick, heavy air, dense with the scent of smoke, sweat, and mildew. The wooden ceiling hangs low, its beams blackened by kitchen smoke. You're lying on a pile of dry straw, scattered with bits of grass, hearing a rooster crow somewhere outside, cutting through the sound of someone coughing in the house next door. You pull off the thin wool blanket, worn, rough, stiffened by sweat and ash built up over weeks. When your feet touch the floor, it's cold, damp, covered in a fine layer of dust like powder. A cat slinks by, its fur coarse, the animal's musky scent blending with the smell of people, straw, and sour milk left in a clay bowl on the table. You inhale deeply and realize this smell is everywhere, in your hair, your clothes, even your dreams from last night. You shiver, not from cold, but from the weight of your own body, the skin sticky, the oil and grime forming a thin film. No one bathes often here, not because they don't want to, but because they can't. Clean water is a luxury. The well in the village square is used only for cooking, watering crops, or feeding animals. Every bucket of water is as precious as wine. Bathing in cold water during a northern winter could kill you faster than illness, so people learn to live with the smell. In the corner, the fire has burned out, leaving only smouldering smoke. You hear a mother waking her child, her voice hoarse, then the sound of the father's footsteps across the packed earth, heavy and slow. He wears thick wool clothes, his coat stained with dried mud and grease. You can smell him from a few steps away, but no one reacts. Here, no one notices their own scent anymore. It's like the air present, all around, but unspoken. Outside, dawn hasn't fully broken. The fog is thick like milk, blanketing the entire village. You push open the wooden door, its hinges groaning, and a rush of cold air hits you carrying the smell of firewood, horse manure, rotting waste, and fresh bread from the baker's oven down the road. Everything mixes into the distinct aroma of a world that knows nothing of deodorant. The church bell rings in the distance, a dry metallic sound cutting through the fog. The whole village wakes as one. People step out of their homes, walking through mud, their cloth-wrapped shoes worn thin. A woman carries a wooden bucket to fetch water, her skirt hem splashed with mud. A man sweeps his yard with a bundle of twigs, the wind spreading the smell of smoke from the stove. A child runs past, laughing, and you notice the earthy scent of his skin so thick it's like a second layer. Everything here has a smell, but not foul in the modern sense, rather the smell of life unfiltered, the smell of sweat, of labour, of survival. You look around and see this world isn't poor, just raw. The entire village is a symphony of sounds and scents. The clanging of hammers, the animals' calls, the damp grass, the people, the smoke, the rusted iron, the burnt wood. A boy drags a cart of firewood, his thick coat streaked with white salt from dried sweat. An old woman in the distance bakes bread over coals, smoke curling into her grey hair, leaving the scent of fire that will cling to her all winter. Above, pigeons perch on the church roof, no cleaner than the people, their feathers dusted with ash, their wings scattering grit. Each time the wind blows, it's as if the entire village breathes together, one long, heavy exhale of existence, raw and unhidden. You realize that if you lived here long enough, you'd get used to it. Your nose would stop distinguishing between stink and familiarity, the same way city dwellers stop noticing the hum of traffic. You'd wear the same clothes for weeks, then months, until you forget what clean ever meant. Your hands would darken with soot and ash, your hair would stiffen with sweat and flour, and one day you'd smell someone else and think nothing of it. Because here, everyone smells the same. No one is different by scent. You'd understand that in this world, to live means to endure, to exist in filth, in warmth, in smoke and sweat, in silent acceptance that your body doesn't need to be clean to be alive. And when the sun finally rises, shining on thatched roofs and glinting off dew on woolen sleeves, you'll see the beauty of the Middle Ages isn't in purity, but in the raw truth of being human. No perfume, no body wash, no artificial fragrance to hide instinct. Only breath, smoke, and the rough rhythm of life itself. And you standing in that morning of 1348 have become part of it. A foggy morning, where the smell of smoke and sweat blend together inside a wooden house. Faint light seeps through the cracks of the door, not enough to brighten the room, only to make the darkness thicker. The ceiling is so low that if you stand straight, your head might touch the smoke-blackened beams. From the corner of the room, a small fire still flickers weakly in the hearth, crackling softly, giving off a fragile warmth and the scent of ash mixed with burnt fat. Smoke curls through the gaps in the wood, wrapping around everything: the broken chair, the animal hide hanging on the wall, the old basket of bread resting by the floor. Every object carries the scent of time and human presence. In one corner, a woman stirs a pot of thick porridge. The smell of oats, sour milk, and smoke mix into a scent both warm and sharp. A small child sits by the fire, wrapped in a rough wool cloth, face smudged, eyes bright in the firelight, coughing and laughing at the same time. Each cough sounds dry, as if its lungs are coated in ash. This house has no window, only a small vent covered by a piece of sheep hide enough to let the smoke escape but keep the heat inside. The wind slips through, carrying the damp, metallic scent of winter. You breathe in, the smoke burns your throat, your eyes water. You realize this is the smell of a medieval morning, thick, alive, so real it makes your lungs ache. The small house is built entirely of wood, boards overlapped and sealed with mud and straw. Above, cobwebs cover the beams, glistening with dew clinging to soot. Every time the wind blows, the web trembles. Droplets fall and hiss as they hit the fire. Tiny pops sound, and a new wisp of smoke rises, carrying the dense scent of damp, burning wood. Near the doorway, muddy boots lie scattered beside a bundle of firewood, each pair stiffened by dirt and dried manure. When you bend down, the smell hits you straight in the nose, not disgusting, but familiar, like something that simply belongs. The odour is no longer a line between clean and dirty, but the breath of the house itself, the smell of work, of survival. The man of the house walks in, his thick cloak damp with dew, shoes wet, carrying a bundle of freshly cut wood. He sets it down by the fire, brushes away the old ash, and adds new logs. When the flames flare up, the room brightens slightly, the orange glow reflecting on faces tired but untroubled. He turns and says in a raspy voice, "It's colder today than yesterday." The words sound like smoke breathing. Everyone in the house nods. No one replies because they all know it's always cold, for months on end. Outside, the fog hasn't lifted. The village is wrapped in a silver-grey haze. Smoke rises from rooftops like black threads, twisting and vanishing into the mist. Each house is a small box of warmth and human scent. That smell doesn't just come from bodies, it comes from wood, wool, straw, and ash. Everything here absorbs human breath, and together they form the dense perfume of life. A dog curls up by the door, fur wet, nose twitching, letting out a soft whine. It's never been bathed, but no one cares, no one in the house is cleaner than it. The woman ladles porridge into a wooden bowl, steam curling up thickly. She sets it before the child. The child takes it with both hands, blows on it, and eats small spoonfuls. The smell of hot porridge spreading through the air, mingling with sweat, damp wool and smoke. You sit there, listening to the clink of the spoon on the bowl, the crackle of firewood, the wind whistling through the wall gaps. The whole world is packed into a few square meters, yet it's full of sound and scent. When the child finishes eating, the man stands, puts on his heavy coat. He opens the door, and cold air rushes in, sweeping away the smoke, making everything tremble. The woman pulls the hide flap shut, closing the door quickly, trapping the little warmth they've gathered. You realize that here, every bit of warmth, every flicker of light, every wisp of smoke is a small victory against the cold and the damp. They don't live to be clean, they live to survive. And smell of smoke, sweat, and earth is the witness of that struggle. When you sit alone, watching the smoke swirl above your head, you understand why medieval people didn't bathe, because they had no reason strong enough to do so. The water is as sharp as knives, fire is precious, and they've grown so used to living in smell they no longer notice it. In that haze of smoke, everything fades, leaving only sensations: itch, stickiness, warmth, intensity. That is their morning. A foggy morning, heavy with smoke and thick with humanity. Bathing used to be a habit strange as it sounds. It's true. Before Europe fell into an age of fear, people once knew the joy of warm water, of clean skin, and the faint scent of herbs lingering in their hair. But then, what was once routine became forbidden, as if letting water touch your skin was an invitation to the devil himself. Imagine this. In the 13th century, public bathhouses still operated in many great cities. People went there not just to wash, but to talk, eat, even discuss business. But everything changed. Changed by things people couldn't see: disease, war, and fear. When the Black Death swept through Europe, killing millions in just a few years, everything familiar suddenly became dangerous. People began searching for the cause. And they blamed the water. They believed water didn't cleanse, but carried disease. That when you bathed, your pores opened, and poisonous air would seep in, destroying you from within. Sickness didn't come from filth, but from cleanliness. That was the most terrifying belief of all. So people stopped bathing, stopped trusting water, stopped believing the body could touch it and remain safe. Picture this. A morning in the 14th century, in a village, someone says they want to bathe, and others look at them with suspicion. Not because they're lazy, but because they're afraid. Afraid of water, afraid of the cold, afraid of the unseen lurking in the air. Around the same time, the church played a major role. Doctrine taught that nudity was sinful, that the body was the vessel of temptation. To bathe meant to see flesh, to be near desire, to open the door to sin. And so, bathing, once a daily act, became a symbol of corruption. The church urged its followers to keep their bodies pure by keeping their clothes on. They believed the soul needed cleansing more than the flesh, that sweat was natural, but desire was the real danger. The dirtier you were, the more humble and virtuous you seemed. Surviving records tell of saints who proudly went years without bathing. Some pilgrims considered body odor a mark of devotion, as if the scent of their suffering was proof of faith. And so, religion and fear intertwined, strangling every notion of cleanliness. To the medieval mind, bathing wasn't just dangerous, it was an act of betrayal against God. If you washed away the smell of sweat, it meant you were erasing the humility he gave you. It sounds absurd now, but in a world that knew nothing of germs, it made perfect sense. People understood only what they saw, and they saw that those who bathed often tended to die sooner. They bathed in public bathhouses, where everyone shared the same pool of water and disease spread. No one knew why. They only knew that someone who bathed yesterday might be dead tomorrow. So they came to believe that water carried death. A belief so dangerous yet so powerful, it lasted for centuries. Bathhouses were shut down. Rivers became places to wash clothes, not bodies. Society learned to avoid water as if it were a curse. Imagine it, people living their entire lives without ever truly bathing, wiping themselves with dry cloths or vinegar, believing that was enough to keep their souls pure. And to them, it wasn't strange. They had no concept of bad smell, only human smell. That scent was natural, a witness to life itself. They didn't avoid bathing out of laziness, but out of a desire to live. Because in their minds, cleanliness meant danger, and filth meant protection. It sounds like a paradox, but it was how an entire civilization learned to survive in the dark. And if you look closer, you might understand them. When everyone around you dies for reasons no one can explain, you cling to any belief that gives you a sense of control, even if it's an illusion. So, not bathing wasn't ignorance, it was instinct. It was how medieval people coped with a world they didn't understand, a world where death could come from a single breath. And when that fear lasted for generations, it stopped being fear, it became culture. A world where water was no longer a symbol of life, but of death. Where sweat was seen as a shield, and a dirty body was one blessed by God. So if you want to understand them, forget modern hygiene. Imagine living in a world where every drop of water carried danger, where every bath was a gamble with fate. Then you'll see, not bathing wasn't filth, it was survival. And that's why, in just 1 century, people went from loving water to fearing it, from seeing bathing as pleasure to viewing it as a death sentence. A terrifying reversal, but the beginning of the story we're stepping into. You open the door and step outside and realize the whole village is just like you. No one cleaner, no one sweeter, no one different. There's nothing in the air to remind you that clean ever existed. Only cold wind, mud, and human breath drifting like mist. The road before you is a stretch of slush, covered in footprints and wheel marks, where rainwater and garbage blend into greyish-brown mud. Every step squelches, and the smell of the entire village chaotic, alive, and so thick you could almost bite it. From the rooftops, smoke curls in black, twisting streaks through the fog. Each plume carries its own scent: burning wood, animal fat, bread, singed hair, and sometimes meat. Not the fresh kind, you know, but the kind hung all winter blackened with smoke, mixed with ash and salt. Children play in the street, barefoot in the mud, laughing, and no one cares how filthy they get. A little girl with hair clumped together, her face smudged with soot, holds a broken stick as a doll, its eyes drawn with charcoal, its mouth a line of dried fish blood. When you look around, you see the adults aren't much different. A blacksmith works his bellows, his face and arms coated in thick soot, sweat cutting pale streaks down his cheeks. He doesn't bother to wipe it away, it wouldn't matter anyway. Nearby, a woman washes clothes in a basin of murky water, dark and thick. You can't tell if it's from mud, ash, or the very smell of people soaked into the fabric. She scrubs with ash instead of soap. Ash cleans, but leaves behind the scent of smoke, of fire, of something burnt and old. Every time the wind blows, the whole village shivers like a single breathing body. Warm air and the smell of straw rise from the stables, while the market carries the scent of drying fish, onions, and fried fat. Men argue over the price of grain, women talk about the season, about the cow that just died, about the neighbour who coughed blood. No one talks about smell, no one wonders why everyone's skin is greasy, why everyone's hair is matted, why everyone's hands are black. Because everyone is the same. Dirt isn't an individual trait, it's the uniform of the age. You walk past a group of children burning a small pile of trash, fire hissing, smoke thick. They cheer when a rat scurries by, throw stones, laugh as the smoke stings their eyes. Across the road, the butcher hangs slabs of dried mutton, flies buzzing around, and customers still buy as usual. One man sniffs a piece, bites it, dips it in salt, doesn't flinch. Maybe because in this world, the smells of rot, decay, and humanity have all merged into one. Everything smells, and nothing is dirtier than the rest. As you walk deeper into the village, you realize no one looks at you as a stranger. Their eyes are calm, peaceful, as if they've accepted everything around them. The smell, the mud, the hunger, the stickiness of their own bodies. An old woman sits by her doorway, combing her hair with a wooden comb missing teeth. Her hair is grey, coarse like burnt wool. She looks up at you, smiles, toothless, and says something in her thick dialect. You don't understand, but it sounds warm. That smile in the smoke, in the human smell, makes you feel at ease. Perhaps when everyone lives within the same scent, judgment disappears. Here, there's no perfume, no soap, no pure fragrance to hide the truth. They live real, smell real, and love real. When a husband holds his wife, he doesn't smell her scent, he smells her warmth. When a child leans on his mother, he smells smoke and wool, the scent of home. The smell that we now call foul was, to them, the smell of family. You stop by the well, look down at the lead-coloured water. The surface reflects a face you barely recognise your own, hair tangled, skin darkened with smoke, clothes coated in dust. You hardly know yourself anymore. Maybe you've started to become one of them. The wind blows, carrying cold and the smell of ash. You inhale, not disgusted anymore, just familiar. In the centre of the village, a group of children shout, chasing each other around a pile of wood. Far away, the church bell rings. Its sound spreads through the mist, blending with the moo of cattle, the calls of villagers, the crackle of fire. And suddenly, you realize this entire village, with all its stench, smoke, and breath, is the true heartbeat of life. No clean water, no fragrance, nothing to hide behind, only existence raw and enduring. You understand now, in this world, not bathing isn't a sign of filth, but a way to survive. A way to breathe together, to endure together, to exist together in the one scent no one can escape. And in that moment, standing there among smoke and fog, you no longer see them as dirty, but as real. The people of the age of scent, alive, unwashed, and utterly human. Woolen clothes, sweat soaked through every layer, the smell of salted meat, animal waste, and wood smoke blended into one. It was the signature scent of the Middle Ages, a smell you couldn't wash away, couldn't hide, and couldn't escape. They wore many layers, not for fashion or status, but for warmth. Each layer was a shield, a rough fabric barrier between human skin and biting wind. But that protection was also a trap. Sweat had nowhere to go, it seeped into the fabric, dried, then dampened again. Day after day, the cloth became a second skin, heavy, greasy, and thick with odor. You could smell your own body even when you didn't move. When a man bent down, the smell of skin, sweat, ash, and iron mingled together. When a woman lifted her arm, the scent of damp wool and sour milk from her clothes spread through the air like a mist. Children ran by, leaving behind the smell of earth and dust in their wake. The entire village felt like one giant creature, breathing every exhale filled with smoke, sweat, and time. Inside a wooden house, you saw a mother folding her husband's coat. The coat was thick, heavy, and so infused with scent that it was impossible to tell where the smell of man ended and the smell of fabric began. When she pressed it to her chest, as if to hold on to warmth, she didn't grimace. That smell was the smell of family, of familiarity, of safety. Outside, the blacksmith's hammer rang again, the scent of hot iron spreading through the air, blending with the kitchen smoke drifting from the next roof. Flames devoured wood, releasing black smoke mixed with oil and burning fat. The air grew thick, sticky like honey, but heavier, harsher. Each gust of wind carried every scent with it: straw, hay, salted meat, human skin, ash, and the faint tang of animal waste mixed in the mud. If you lived here long enough, you'd learn to recognize them all. The smell of horses burnt and warm, the smell of sheep, damp wool and milk, the smell of people, everything that remains when smoke fades and wind stills. In the next house, a man hung strips of dried meat above the hearth. He had no refrigerator, no refined salt, only smoke and time. Each piece was hung high, smoked for weeks, even months. The smell of charred meat, melting fat, and settled ash filled the home like a perfume of survival. You stood under the eaves, watching smoke drift through the wooden cracks, listening to fat drip and sizzle on the coals, and realized that scent was the flavor of life itself. It was how they kept food, kept warmth, and kept living through the winter. When the wind passed, the smell of smoked meat merged with the smell of humans, forming a fragrance both alluring and unpleasant. Not pleasant like baked bread, not memorable like flowers, but clinging, dense, seeping into hair, clothes, and every pore. Even if you left this village, that scent would follow you like a memory. At the far end of the village, near the stables, a farmer shoveled straw. Mud and dung formed a thick layer on the ground, warmth rising from it like mist. Animals and people lived side by side in the same scent, the same breath. The cows exhaled white vapor, their noses dripping, their odor so strong it felt visible, but no one covered their nose. No one minded. It was the smell of winter, of warmth, of sustenance. A child carried a bucket of water, stumbled on a rock. The water spilled, mud splashing everywhere. The mother laughed, didn't scold. The mud would dry, cling to their shoes, and become another layer in the shared scent of the village. Every smell blended with the next, like souls merging into one collective life. Here, smell wasn't just a consequence, it was identity. As you walked through, you understood that medieval people weren't stinky the way we imagine. They simply lived within a different system of scent, a world where smell wasn't used to divide the rich from the poor, but to feel alive. And within that chaos, something strange happened. You began to adjust. The longer you stayed, the more comfortable it felt. Smoke became background, human scent became breath, dried meat became warmth, horse manure became familiar. What once made you wince now felt safe, as if it were the smell of home. Maybe, you thought, this was how medieval people found peace amid filth, by forgetting the line between clean and alive. They didn't avoid bathing out of neglect, but because they no longer saw themselves apart from the world around them. Every scent was a reminder that they were still living, still breathing, still existing together in the endless loop of sweat, smoke, earth, and time. And in that moment, as you inhaled deeply, taking in the smell of the entire village, you no longer felt disgust. You felt like part of it, a part of that great, living odor called life in the Middle Ages. Oily skin, greasy hair, but no one found it strange. The smell of people was natural. In that world, the idea of cleanliness wasn't tied to respect or confidence like we think today. It was simply a luxury unnecessary for survival. When you walked down the street, no one turned to look because your clothes smelled, because they did too. They no longer noticed their own scent because everything, from clothes to air to skin itself, shared the same smell. A smell they lived with, breathed with, worked with, loved with. They were born into it, grew up in it, and died wrapped in it. If you asked a medieval person about body odor, they might be puzzled and laugh. How could one call their own body foul? Your scent was you proof that you were alive, sweating, working, existing among earth and smoke. A man just returned from the fields. He set down his bundle of wood, took off his wool cap, sweat sticking to his hair and neck. His face gleamed in the dim light, not from oil or balm, but from the natural sheen his skin produced. He wiped his forehead, then smiled as his little son ran to hug him. The boy didn't flinch, only buried his face in his father's chest, where the smell of smoke, sweat, and dry grass blended together. That was the smell of safety. To them, it wasn't the smell of dirt, but of family. Inside, a woman cooked. She stirred a thick pot of soup with a wooden spoon, steam rising, sweat beading on her forehead, sliding down her cheek. She didn't wipe it, just brushed her hair back with the back of her hand. Her hair was matted, darkened by sweat and smoke, but when the firelight hit it, it glowed like copper. There was a kind of beauty there, raw, human, real. No makeup, no morning wash, yet she radiated life. Because beauty here didn't come from cleanliness, but endurance. In this world, the body wasn't something to be hidden, but a tool for survival. It had to bear cold, rain, and dust, and so it became tougher, thicker, but also more honest. Medieval people didn't try to change their bodies, they lived with them as part of nature, like earth, like fire, like wind. When they spoke of human scent, it wasn't a complaint, it was acceptance. They had no perfume, but the scent of dry grass lingered in their hair. The aroma of freshly baked bread clung to their skin, and the smoke of the hearth soaked into their clothes. Those smells told their stories of the work they did, the places they lived, the lives they endured. A young woman returned from the market, a basket of apples in her arms, her dress streaked with mud, hem-soaked. As she passed, the scent of ripe apples and smoke mixed into something strange. Not pleasant, but real, as if you could feel her breath in it. In that world, no one lost themselves in artificial fragrance. Everyone had their own signature scent, the smell of skin, hair, work, home. The blacksmith smelled of iron and fire, the farmer of grass and sweat, the baker of flour and smoke, the woman of milk, ash, and a hint of yeast's sweetness. No scent masked another, because they all shared the same thick air. On rainy days, when fog covered the village, the smell grew stronger. The damp earth seeped into walls, the scent of rotting grass mixed with the wind, and every breath carried a metallic tang. But no one minded. They were used to it. Their bodies had adapted their senses too. Just as your ears stop hearing city noise, their noses stopped noticing their own odor. They didn't live to escape the smell, they lived to exist with it. There was something strange. In that world of scent, people still fell in love, still felt attraction. A young man reached out to help a woman across a puddle. The smoke on his coat mixed with the scent of her hair, and in that earthy blend of ash and sweat, something warm stirred. Maybe, without perfume to deceive, people were left only with instinct. They smelled each other, and knew each other that way. Scent became a mark of closeness, of trust, of connection. The smell of people wasn't just breath, it was a language, a way to recognize, to believe, to bond. When night fell, everyone gathered around the fire, wrapped in thick wool, faces flushed from the heat, Smoke filled the room. Body heat rose, blending in the damp air. No one spoke of discomfort, only of harvests, of the coming winter, of old stories. The firelight flickered in their eyes, and you realized what they smelled wasn't filth, it was the breath of life. The smell we now avoid was the one they lived with, even depended on. It reminded them they were alive, that their bodies still worked, that they still had strength to love, to labor, to live one more day. In that world, the smell of people wasn't shameful. It was proof that they were still human. The church taught that bathing naked was a sin, that water could carry disease, not purification. From the high stone towers, that warning echoed down through villages, through cities, through the thatched rooftops where smoke curled into the sky. The sound of church bells each morning wasn't just a call to prayer, it was the rhythm of order and faith. Medieval people lived in a world where God stood at the center, and the body, the vessel of the soul, was sacred ground that one must feel ashamed of. The body was not meant to be shown, nor enjoyed, but restrained, endured, and sacrificed. In every sermon, priests preached that water could cleanse the soul through baptism, but for the mortal body, it was the path to temptation and disease. When someone undressed to bathe, they exposed the flesh, the weakest, most sinful part of humanity. Water, to them, was no longer a symbol of life, but a test of faith. Imagine a sermon in the evening, inside a dark church, candlelight flickering across the faces of the faithful. The smell of melting wax and human sweat mixed together, heavy as incense. The priest stood at the pulpit, his voice rough and low, speaking of the sins of the flesh, the purity of the soul. He told of those who had fallen in steam, people who dared to visit public bathhouses, where bare skin touched another's, bringing sin upon themselves. The congregation shuddered, bowed their heads, prayed. No one dared to ask why water was sinful, because to ask was to doubt faith. And in an age where belief outweighed reason, doubt was the gravest sin. A man returned home after Mass, shoes muddy, face thoughtful. He looked at his wife washing clothes with ash and said quietly, "Don't use too much water." The wife looked up, didn't answer, only nodded. In their eyes was fear, but also resignation, as if water truly had become something dangerous, to be feared. No one bathed like before. They wiped themselves with cloth, dabbed with vinegar, or simply changed undergarments when they felt itchy. And in doing so, they believed they were keeping their souls clean. The church didn't just shape faith, it shaped how people understood their own bodies. From childhood, children were taught that the body was where sin could hide. A 12-year-old girl, seeing people bathe in a river for the first time, covered her eyes, curious but afraid. Her mother pulled her away, whispering, "Don't look. The water's dirty. Those who bathe will be punished by God." The girl believed it, because her mother believed, because the priest said so. The whole village believed. And so, generation after generation, people lived in fear. Fear of water, of flesh, of themselves. Each person became the guardian of their own sin, living in a world where cleanliness meant suspicion and filth meant virtue. To them, a dirty body didn't matter as long as the soul was pure. They believed God didn't see through skin, but through the heart, so they prayed more often than they bathed. They believed water couldn't wash away sin, only holy water could. But that water wasn't for the body, it was for the soul, in the baptism of newborns. Beyond that, no one needed to bathe. In great cities, where cathedrals rose like fortresses, that fear spread faster. A noble woman walked the streets, her thick cloak soaked in perfume, her skin untouched by water for months. Yet she didn't feel dirty. On the contrary, she felt proud. To her, perfume and ash rubbed on the body were signs of restraint of faith. Her servant, standing a few steps behind, bowed his head against the suffocating smell, but said nothing. No one dared mention bathing. It wasn't just foolish, it was sinful. Those who washed with water were seen as worldly, weak in faith, people who valued flesh over spirit. And so, drop by drop, water vanished from human life. They lived in layers of dust and oil, and called it humility. Some said, the less you cared for the body, the closer you were to God, because God did not dwell in clean skin, but in a heart that endures. When winter came, and wind howled through the shutters. You saw people huddled by the fire, rubbing their hands, breathing out steam. Everyone wrapped tight. No one thought of undressing to wash. Their bodies reeked, but their hearts were calm. They believed that smell was the scent of life itself, proof they hadn't been forgotten by God. The church taught them to live that way, and they believed absolutely. So much so that when they saw clear water, they felt fear. Because in that transparency, they saw their own reflection blurred, small and sinful. So they turned away, avoided it. Better to live in mud than face the truth. And so, in the heart of the Middle Ages, where cathedrals rose like pillars of faith, people learned to avoid water, to avoid their own bodies, and to accept living in smell as part of God's grace. Only the nobility had private baths, using milk, wine, or rose petals to scent themselves, while villagers accepted living with the smell of sweat and smoke behind the thick stone walls. The aristocracy created an entirely different world. There, smell wasn't a mark of survival but a symbol of power. Imagine, inside a wide stone chamber, candlelight shimmering on a massive wooden tub lined with white linen. The water inside, not ordinary water, but a mixture boiled with wine, rose petals, and herbs. Servants carried bucket after bucket of warm water, pouring it in, steam rising like mist, softening the air. Within that haze, a noblewoman sat in the tub, pearls around her neck, curls framing her pale skin untouched by sunlight. She didn't bathe to be clean, but to exude fragrance. That scent didn't just cling to her skin, it declared her status. She belonged to the class that didn't work, didn't sweat, didn't reek like peasants. In one corner, a servant knelt, gently rubbing her shoulders with wine foam. They didn't dare look up to gaze upon the mistress's body was sin. When the water cooled, the lady gestured to change it. Pour it out, reheat it, add more petals. Outside, dozens of villagers lived their entire lives without ever seeing a bath, while here, water flowed away as if it meant nothing. Cleanliness became a privilege, a luxury reserved for those with the power and leisure to smell of perfume instead of sweat. But strangely, even though they were allowed to bathe, they rarely did. The nobility feared water no less than the poor. They didn't soak to cleanse, they soaked to infuse. For them, clean skin mattered less than fragrant skin. After bathing in milk or wine, they rubbed their bodies with a mixture of almond oil, honey, and herbal powder to trap the scent. Over time, their bodies became like living candles, constantly emitting the scent of flowers, but beneath it still lingered the odor of sweat, flesh, and the stale air of sealed rooms. That noble fragrance, if you sniffed close enough, was sweet, sour, and musky all at once, just like the contradictions of their lives. Beautiful on the surface, but rotting within. A young count walked down a red-carpeted hall, his cloak embroidered with gold thread, each step leaving behind a heavy trail of resin, perfume, and wine. As he passed the maids, they bowed not just out of respect, but because the air around him was suffocating. In those days, the stronger the perfume, the richer the noble. Scents, especially those imported from the East, were worth more than gold. A vial of perfume no larger than a finger could buy a servant's monthly wage. So they poured it, rubbed it, burned oils in their bedrooms, soaked their gloves in fragrant solutions and wore them all day, to the point where entering a castle meant struggling to breathe. Rose, lavender, pine resin, musk, amber, all swirling together into a heavy cloud wrapping around every person. It was no longer the smell of humanity, but of power. While villagers used smoke for warmth, nobles used scent to mask their humanity. When night fell, the nobility lay on velvet-covered beds, straw mattresses below soaked in scented oil. But as the oil went rancid, the stench mingled with the perfume, forming a smell no one dared to criticize, only to call peculiarly sweet. They lived in luxury, yet no one was truly clean. The castle walls grew moss, carpets trapped dust, bath water drained into channels beneath the floor, sometimes straight into the street. Villagers called it the smell of the rich. They heard tales of nobles bathing in wine, but couldn't imagine what that scent was like. They only knew that whenever the nobles' horses passed by, the wind carried a sickly sweet perfume that overpowered the smell of cattle and wood smoke. To the poor, that fragrance was both a dream and a distance. They believed that those who smelled so sweet were no longer ordinary, they were God's chosen. Some legends even claimed that noble souls released the scent of roses after death, while the poor smelled of soil. That belief widened the divide between them. One side lived in artificial fragrance, the other in the raw scent of life. But if you looked closely, both were victims of the same fear. Fear of water, fear of the body, fear of their own natural scent. In that bright chamber, the noble woman closed her eyes, thinking she was being cleansed. But in truth, she was bathing in illusion, the fragrance of flowers and wine masking the smell of flesh. Meanwhile, outside, among mist and mud, the peasant wiped his sweat, living in the scent of earth and humanity, the real scent. If you placed those two smells side by side, you'd see the naked truth of the Middle Ages. Everyone smelled, the only difference was that one reeked of artifice, the other of life. And in the end, whether noble or peasant, when night fell, when fires dimmed and perfumes faded, what lingered in the air was the scent of being human. Peasants wiped their bodies with cloth soaked in vinegar or ash, calling it the sacred dry wash. In small fog-covered villages, where water had become both a luxury and a fear, people had to invent another way to bathe. No showers, no soap, no tubs. They turned to the only things they had: vinegar, ash, and faith. Each morning or evening, the woman of the house would heat a small pot of warm water, not for bathing, but for wetting a cloth. On the wooden table, an old linen towel soaked in water mixed with vinegar. That vinegar wasn't fragrant, it was sharp, sour, biting. When pressed against the skin, it stung, made them wince. But they believed that sourness could drive away evil spirits, kill disease, and cleanse invisible sins. They called it the sacred dry wash, a way to bathe without water, only with faith. A mother carefully wiped her child's hands, from wrist to elbow, then his face. She whispered a short prayer. May God cleanse this body as he cleanses the soul. To them, water might bring sickness, but vinegar would not, nor would ash. Ash was seen as something purified by fire, and fire was the symbol of God. They mixed ash with a bit of fat, making a thick paste, then rubbed it on their bodies like cream. When it dried, they brushed it off, believing that all dirt fell away with it. The rough sting on their skin was proof that their bodies were being cleaned. Older folk used dried herbs, rosemary, mint, or lavender, crushed and sewn into small cloth pouches, worn around the neck or tucked inside clothes. They believed the faint scent from those herbs could mask sweat, and more importantly, protect them from bad air. Because in that age, people didn't know what germs were. They believed disease came from bad smells. If they couldn't bathe to be clean, they'd try to make their bodies smell better with whatever they could find in the kitchen. An old woman sat by the fire, stirring a pot of ash and vinegar, laughing. This is the baptism of the poor. Her words were both true and sad. People believed that every time they wiped themselves this way, their souls were also partially purified. On some evenings, the whole family gathered around the hearth, passing the same towel. Each person used a different corner, then hung it near the fire to dry. That towel was reused, day after day, until it frayed and tore, its threads forever carrying the dry scent of vinegar. When tired, they believed wiping themselves this way drove away evil spirits, made their bodies stronger, their hearts lighter. Every home had a jar of vinegar, and the towel that smelled of it was treated like a sacred object. Sometimes women mixed vinegar with ash to wash their hair. Once dry, their hair stiffened, shone in the firelight but carried a strong sour scent. Still, they felt proud. It meant they cared for their bodies. Unlike nobles soaking in flowers, the poor bathed in the scent of earth, fire, and vinegar. A farmer returned from the fields, his back slick with sweat. He didn't bathe. He just took the vinegar cloth and wiped his neck and arms. The sour smell rose, covering the sweat for a while, making him feel cleaner. To them, clean no longer meant white, it meant free from bad smells. Bad didn't mean foul, it meant the scent of sickness, of death. And so, the sacred dry wash wasn't just a hygiene habit, but a survival ritual. In a world where people believed water opened the door to illness, vinegar and ash became their charms of protection. A priest once wrote in his journal, "The villagers use ash to wash away sin, but in truth, they are only reaching for the feeling of purity." He was right in that era. People didn't bathe with water. They bathed with illusion, with faith that they could still be clean in another way. When winter came, the ritual became even more common. No one dared touch cold water, fearing one bath could freeze their lungs. Vinegar became salvation. A few drops on a cloth could make them feel warmer, more alive. Many believed that sour scent could even trick death itself. Some who died in winter were wiped with vinegar and ash before burial, a final cleansing. Not to be clean, but to let their souls leave in peace. For the living, it was love. For the dead, a final gift. You see, even in poverty and fear, people found a way to keep their dignity. They had no water to wash away the dirt, but they still wanted to be clean. They didn't understand germs, but they understood faith. And that faith that a vinegar-soaked cloth could purify the soul was what made them human. Amid the sour, smoky human smell, they found a small hope that they were still pure. Even if their bodies were never truly washed, their souls were still sacredly dry-cleaned. Clothes were scarce, rarely washed, so people wore them until they fell apart. In a world without mass-weaving machines, without cheap fabric, every garment was the result of weeks, even months of labor. From rough, hand-spun wool, women wove thick, heavy, stiff cloth. It was dyed with herbs, but the color never lasted after just a few wears. Sweat, smoke, and dirt darkened it. And still, they wore it, year after year. Clothing wasn't just something to cover the body, it was property, a shield between people and a harsh world. When winter came, that same garment saved their lives, holding in a bit of warmth through the cold nights. That's why they didn't change or wash it easily. Washing clothes meant using clean water, a luxury more precious than wine. People only washed when they had no other choice, when the fabric was so dirty it stuck to their skin. Each family usually had only a few sets of clothes, one for daily life, one for festivals, and sometimes one burial shroud kept for death. The festival garment was stored carefully in a wooden chest, wrapped in rough fabric. No one dared use it. It smelled of wood and mould, sometimes with a sprig of dried herbs tucked in to keep insects away. Peasants wore thick wool all season, until their clothes stiffened like wood. The smell of sweat soaked so deep it could never be washed out. When it grew warm, they removed their outer layer, keeping only the inner one, but still didn't bathe, because even the underclothes were like a second skin. Imagine that garment for months. It absorbed oil, dust, sweat, ash, then dried, then dampened again, then dried once more. It became an object of memory. If you picked it up, the scent of its owner clung to your hands, as if they were still there. Some elders said that when a loved one died, they kept their clothes because their smell is still here. In an age when perfume was a luxury, the smell of a person was the thread that tied affection together. But for the living, clothes were a burden. When it rained, the fabric grew heavy with water. When it dried, it hardened like bark. In winter, it kept them alive, but in summer, it burned like fire. They had no other choice. No one thought of changing clothes daily or washing weekly. They wore them until the wool frayed, until elbows tore and shoulders ripped, then patched them up, layer upon layer. A single garment could last 2 generations, passed from father to son, from son to grandson. The patches became marks of endurance, even pride. In a small village, people recognized each other by their clothes. That's Anne's coat, woven during the plague, someone might say. That coat carried stories and time itself. When you looked around the village, no one looked alike, but all wore the same colours: brown, grey, beige, sometimes dark blue. Not because they liked simplicity, but because other colours were expensive. Reds and purples came from rare roots or insects, affordable only to nobles. Common folk lived within the palate of the earth, quite literally. Their clothes didn't just smell of people, but of seasons. In winter, they reeked of smoke. In spring, of damp soil. In summer, of sweat. In autumn, of straw. All year, the scent of fabric and the scent of life merged as one. A mother carefully folded her husband's coat, heavy, frayed, thick as hide. She sighed, but didn't complain. Every stitch was her sweat, her time, her calloused hands. When her son grew up, that coat would be altered to fit him. Clothes weren't just possessions, they were the inheritance of poverty. To the medieval soul, clothing was also home, something carried everywhere, shielding them from the wind, from prying eyes, even from death. When they died, they were often buried in the same clothes. No one thought of white shrouds. White wasn't the colour of life. It was the colour of luxury, of nobility, of those who never feared the cold. For peasants, a brown, dirty, patched coat was the colour of humanity itself. On rainy days, the damp smell rising from their clothes made it hard to breathe, but no one dared take them off. To undress meant letting cold air touch the skin foolish, inviting illness. So they let the clothes dry naturally, even if it took days. Once dry, they stiffened again, but when they put them back on, they felt safe, as if the dirt had turned into armour. You might think they suffered, but really, they'd grown used to it. They couldn't remember what new clothes felt like. They didn't know the softness of clean fabric, nor did they need to. What they needed was warmth, and they had it bought with sweat and smoke. Sometimes they stuffed dried herbs between layers to mask the smell, but it rarely worked. The scent of humanity always won. Yet perhaps that very smell made them feel alive. In a world without baths, where everything gathered dust, a dirty garment became a symbol of endurance. When you walk through the village and see an old man hunched by the fire, his coat so worn you can't tell where the old stitches end and the new patches begin, you'll understand they weren't just wearing clothes. They were wearing their lives. Every stain was a day survived, every tear a winter endured. They wore their clothes until they rotted into dust, then wore new ones woven from that same dust. A closed circle, where cloth, smell, and humanity became one simple, harsh, but utterly real. Keep dirty to keep warm. That was a common saying in the Middle Ages. It sounds crude, but it was the truth of survival. In a freezing world where winter winds could cut through walls, where fire was a treasure and water a threat, people had to choose between being clean and being alive. And they chose to live. When you step into a house in the winter of 1348, you'll understand why. Inside, wind howls through cracks in the door, smoke from the hearth curls around the low ceiling, and everything is coated in a thin layer of grease from furniture to skin. But that grease, that dust, that grime, was their invisible armour against the cold. Peasants didn't bathe, not because they were lazy, but because they knew if they did, their skin would lose its natural oil, the very thing that kept them warm. Clean skin was weak skin, and weakness meant death. They believed it as firmly as they believed in the ground beneath their feet. Field workers wore thick wool coats, layered clothes underneath, and never took them off, not even to sleep. As they worked, sweat soaked through, absorbed into the fabric, then dried, forming a stiff layer. Day by day, month by month, it built up like a second hide. At night, when the wind blew through the walls, it was that dirt that held in the warmth. A man sat by the fire, rough hands stretched toward the flame, his skin dark, cracked, some spots bleeding. He didn't use ointment, he rubbed animal fat on it instead. The smell was heavy, greasy, but warm. That was how they healed the cold, not with water, but with oil, with sweat, with fat. Their bodies grew tougher, resistant to the wind, carrying the scent of earth, fire, and survival. Sometimes, people deliberately smeared lard or ash mixed with oil on their skin, a kind of armour against the cold. It sounds vile, but in that time, it was wisdom. A woman once said she nearly froze to death after bathing in a river one winter. Since then, she swore she'd never let water touch her again. She said, "Dirty stinks, but clean kills." The saying spread, becoming a mantra. During long winters, when snow-covered rooftops and people lived in darkness around a small fire, their eyes stung from smoke, their clothes reeked of burnt wood. They didn't bathe, but they survived. And that was all that mattered. In the stone houses of the nobility, even with baths available, people did much the same. They rubbed scented oils and perfumes on their skin, not to be clean, but to seal their pores, believing it kept out the cold poison in the air. From peasant to noble, everyone feared that water opened the door to illness. To stay dirty, to stay smelly, to keep smoke on their bodies, these were all ways to lock that door shut. When you live in an age where medicine was darkness, folk wisdom became scripture, And keep dirty to keep warm was one of those scriptures. Someone once said, "We don't need baths to live, only fire and scent." Indeed, their scent, sweat, grease, smoke, earth was also a sign of life. If you walked through a village on a cold morning, you'd see them wrapped tightly in wool, breath steaming, faces streaked with dust but eyes still bright. They weren't fragrant, but they were alive. They weren't clean, but they weren't cold. In barns, animals slept beside people. Their shared body heat filled the space. The smell of beasts, of humans, of straw, of dung, all blending into the scent of survival. Strong, but warm. People learned to sleep in that air, to treat it like a blanket. A child curled up in hay, her mother laying a sheepskin over her, still wearing the same dirty clothes she'd worn all week. The girl slept peacefully, cheeks red with warmth. No one dared undress to be clean, because to undress was to lose the shield of sweat, oil, and dust, the very layer keeping them alive. In a world where cold could kill, dirty became an ally, and clean an enemy. When spring came and the snow melted, they opened their doors to the wind. The whole village filled with the sour scent of old fabric, of bodies, of sweat built up over months. But they smiled, because that smell meant they had survived the winter. There were no festivals, no horns or drums, only hearth smoke, ash, and quiet relief. Someone sat on the doorstep, holding their hands out to the first light, fingers dry and cracked, nails black with soot, but eyes shining. Every stain on their skin was a victory. Keep dirty to keep warm. It sounds unpleasant, but to them, it was philosophy. It taught that the body wasn't for display, but for endurance, for survival, to withstand the brutal winter. When night came, fires burned again, smoke rose again, the smell thickened, but this time, you didn't feel disgust, you felt warmth. Because that smell that was the scent of people surviving in an unyielding world. In their time, filth wasn't shame, it was proof of existence. If you were still dirty, it meant you were still alive. And on those freezing nights, when the wind screamed through thatched roofs and the firelight flickered on soot-darkened faces, you would understand keep dirty to keep warm wasn't neglect. It was the simplest, most human prayer for life. Those without a scent were suspected of witchcraft or disease. In the Middle Ages, smell wasn't just a mark of the body, it was a measure of existence, something that defined a person. In a world where everyone smelled, no smell became something terrifying. Imagine this. In a village thick with the smells of smoke, sweat, animal hide, and rotting straw, someone walks by carrying no scent at all. No smoke, no sweat, no earth, no ash, no human smell. Strange, isn't it? But to the villagers, it wasn't admirable, it was unnatural, even dangerous. They whispered, "He's too clean. He can't be human." In an age where everything was explained through faith and fear, cleanliness became more suspicious than filth. People believed that only those possessed by demons or practicing sorcery could lack a smell because their bodies no longer breathed with the world. They said, a real person must have the smell of life, the scent of sweat, of earth, of smoke that was the scent of a soul still inside flesh. Anyone without it meant their soul had been taken by something else. There was once a woman accused of witchcraft simply because she smelled better than others. She was an herbalist, skilled at boiling lavender and rosemary in oil, using it to anoint her wrists and collar. The fragrance spread around her, and the village began to look at her with a mix of fear and fascination. At first they called her the Woman of Flowers. But rumours spread. She cast spells with scent. She used fragrance to seduce men. One day, when plague struck the village, she became the sacrifice of their fear. They said that because she had no human smell, God had punished them all. They tied her up and drowned her. When she died, the water reeked of mud and flesh, and people took it as proof that the demon in her had been purged. Cruel, but that was belief. For in those days no one knew what germs were. Everything was understood through smell. Smell became the mirror of the soul. Too fragrant a witch. No smell diseased. Only the human scent was safe. Even when someone grew ill and began to lose their body odour, others believed their soul was leaving. When their smell vanished, they knew death was near. That scent became the sign of life, like a heartbeat, like a breath. A mother pressed her nose to her sick child's neck and whispered, "As long as you still smell, you're still alive." When the child weakened, the scent faded, and she wept. To them, smell was instinct, the deepest connection between people. No smell meant losing that connection, and losing connection meant danger. There were tales of scentless wanderers who came to villages at night, no one knowing where they came from. They left no trace, no smoke, no sweat, no odour. And when they left, by morning, an animal was found dead, or someone fell ill. Villagers believed they were wandering souls, the wrongly dead returning in the form of the clean. Thus, clean became unnatural. A faint stench, a trace of smoke on skin, these became proofs of life. Paradoxical, isn't it? But that was the truth of their world, a time when smell was the only way to tell the living from the dead, the human from the ghost. In cities, where nobles wore perfume, peasants believed fragrance was hiding the soul. They feared the scented, thinking perfumes were made from blood and animal corpses, dark magic. Some priests preached, "He who uses fragrance to mask the smell of flesh defies the nature given by God." And people believed them. They began to see scent as God's honest gift, something that couldn't be faked. Artificial fragrance, on the other hand, was the devil's trick. Sometimes you'd see strange sights. Groups of people attending mass, each carrying a wilted herb, not to smell good, but to cover the smell of others, so no one would think they were too clean. Everyone tried to smell themselves, afraid that if their scent disappeared, they would too. On holy days, when priests swung censers and filled the church with incense, people prayed with both reverence and fear. They believed that standing too close to the fragrant smoke could drown out their human scent, and their soul would lose its way. Some deliberately stood back to keep their own smell intact. You might laugh, but that was how they stayed safe in a world without science. Smell was their invisible shield, both protection and identity. The scented were alive, but the scentless were forgotten. When night fell, the village went quiet. Only the wind, the hearth smoke, and the lingering smell of people remained. In the darkness, the only thing that reminded them they still existed was that smell, that raw human odour, so strong it became sacred. So if someone ever walked into the village without a smell, the world seemed to stop. No one spoke, no one approached. Because deep down, they believed a person without a scent wasn't a person at all, but something they never wanted to touch. The whole market was like an ocean of smells: leather, fat, fish, dung, and herbs barely masking despair. From early morning, before the mist had even lifted, the cries of vendors echoed down the uneven cobblestone street. You step into that scene and are instantly surrounded by a mixture of odours so thick it almost knocks you back. The smell of burning fat from the fried pastry stall, the sour stench of dried fish rising from wicker baskets, the damp, musty leather from the shoemaker's bench, the sun-warmed pork hanging on hooks, the horse manure from a cart that just passed, and the sweat of the crowd pressing close. The air is heavy, moist, sticky, thick enough to cut with a knife. Vendors shout, dressed in clothes darkened by dust and sweat. They stand behind rotting wooden stalls, one hand gripping a knife, the other holding fish, the smell of it soaked so deep into their skin it will never wash out. In a corner, a woman selling herbs scatters dried leaves on her table. Mint, lavender, and rosemary drift through the air, struggling to mask the rot of nearby meat. That scent is like a faint breath amid a storm of stench, fragile, but proud. The woman smiles, murmuring, "This scent won't save anyone, but it helps them forget the smell of death." And it's true in a medieval market. The smell of death was everywhere, in the trash, in the animals, in the people. Next to the fish stand, a butcher hacks at meat. Each strike sends blood spraying, splattering onto the ground, mixing with mud. The iron tang of blood and raw fat rises up, blending with the smell of singed hide as they scorch it clean. That smell clings to the air, to hands, and follows them home. A few steps away, a cheesemonger sells great wheels of cheese, cracked, yellowed, sour, and bitter, their smell filling the square. To a modern nose, it might be nauseating, but to them, it was the scent of life itself. It meant the food was still alive, not spoiled, not rotten edible enough to survive another day. Every smell in the market carried meaning. The burnt crust of bread was the smell of fullness. The reek of fish was the smell of survival. The stink of horse manure was the scent of trade. The odour of people was the smell of endurance. Together, they formed a symphony of the filthy century. The clang of hammers, the chop of knives, children shouting, people bargaining, all mixed together. And amid the smoke and dust, it was the smell that kept everything real, reminding you that you were still in the living world. A child runs past, clutching a stale loaf of bread, barefoot, his clothes torn. He pauses at a herb stall, leans in, and sniffs a sprig of rosemary. His eyes light up. He smiles, then walks away. A fleeting whiff of grace in a world that didn't know cleanliness. In the centre of the market, merchants sell spices brought from the east: nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger, pepper. They're so expensive that only nobles could afford them, but commoners still stop to take a breath, as if inhaling heaven. They believe those scents could cleanse their souls, make them feel different, even for a moment. The sellers know this well, always saying, "This is the fragrance of those favoured by God." And so they buy not to eat, but to dream of another life, one that smelled a little less human. Along the main road, the smell of tanned leather stings your eyes. The tanners soak hides in vats mixed with urine, a necessary step to soften them. The fermenting stench of ammonia rises, blending with the animal dung used to polish the hides. Every motion of their hands releases another wave of odour into the air. No one minds. That smell is the smell of their bread, their coins. A young worker laughs, saying, "If there's no smell, it means I haven't worked enough." And truly, in the market, smell was the measure of labour. The dirtier you were, the more real you were. The stronger your scent, the more trustworthy. Anyone who came to market clean was met with suspicion, as if they didn't belong. So smell became a boundary between us and them. At the far end of the market, where a drainage ditch runs, trash, dung, and blood mix into a thick stream, oozing past people's feet. Bubbles rise, bursting with the stink of rot so dense it feels like smoke. Yet no one avoids it. Children splash in it. Adults step through it. Some even rinse their hands there. The smell of death, the smell of life, the smell of hope, all flow together in that same current, and you stand there, in the sea of scents of a century long gone, both disgusted and mesmerized. Because in all that filth, there is something undeniably real, more real than any artificial fragrance the modern world could ever make. As the sun climbs high, the haze begins to thin, and the smells of meat, fish, and people mingle with the golden light. The crowd keeps laughing, living, trading, as if they no longer notice any of it. Because to them, this isn't a stench, this is the smell of life itself. Every breath in that marketplace is a reminder. People don't live to smell good, they live to survive. And the smell, no matter how foul, is proof of that truth. Herbs, perfume oils, or dried oranges tucked into sleeves to mask one's own scent. Those were the rare, fragrant weapons of the medieval people, fighting against a world thick with the smells of flesh, earth, and death. In a society where bathing was dangerous but living among smells was inevitable, people found countless ways to hide the truth of their own skin. They couldn't wash it away, but they could trick the nose. And so, from nobles to peasants, from nuns to courtesans, everyone sought their own cover scent. In great cities like Paris, Florence, or London, the narrow, damp, stinking streets rang with the calls of sellers hawking scented sachets, small linen bags filled with dried flowers, orange peel, bay leaves, herbs, and sometimes precious resins imported from the East. People tucked them into their sleeves, pressed them to their chests, or hung them from their necks like talismans. Walking through the crowd, they could lift a hand to their nose, take a small breath, and briefly forget the smell of the world. The wealthy took it further. They hired perfumers, the alchemists of scent, to craft personal aromas. A lady in London might spend a servant's month of wages on a vial of rose oil from Damascus. They didn't use water, they used fragrance. Before stepping out, they dabbed a few drops on a handkerchief, a collar, or their hair. The scent followed them as they moved, leaving behind a faint sweetness in the heavy air. But the irony was the more they tried to smell good, the more they stood out. In a world of odours, perfume was suspicious. It made people stare half in admiration, half in doubt. To peasants, it was the mark of a witch, or of the rich who no longer feared anything. In the city, though, it was a badge of rank. The stronger the scent, the higher the status. At noble feasts, the air was thick with rose, resin, amber and musk, a perfumed fog that choked the room. Anyone without their own scent was invisible. But in the darkness, when the lights went out, their real body smell still rose, that raw human odour no oil could hide. Like everything else in that age, scent was a beautiful lie. For the poor, masking their smell was simpler. A woman on her way to the market might tuck a slice of dried orange or a sprig of mint in her sleeve. Whenever the stench grew too strong, she'd raise her hand to her nose and breathe in, reminding herself she was still human. Farmers pinned rosemary in their collars not for beauty, but to mask the sweat that scared their animals. In churches, priests held bunches of dried herbs while reading prayers, both to keep away flies and to cover the stench of death during funerals. In graveyards, where bodies lay shallow, rosemary and lavender became spiritual salvation. People believed sweet scents soothed the soul and silenced fear. So fragrance wasn't just a luxury, it was armor against reality. In the small homes of peasants, the only scent they had was smoke. They believed smoke could cleanse sin, so when they lit their fires, they held their clothes and hair above the smoke to wash clean. They called it smoke bathing. Their bodies reeked of burning wood, but they believed it was a scent God accepted. A mother warmed her child's hands by the fire, smiling as she said, "The smoke will drive the devils away." And so, from rich to poor, from church to market, everyone lived inside layers of scent, smoke, flowers, oil, sweat, and faith. Rosemary, mint, dried orange became small redemptions in a world that could never be clean. Yet even those scents were sweet lies. Because no matter how many herbs you used, the human smell remained beneath the skin, in the hair, soaked into the clothes. It never vanished. It only hid, like truth covered by belief. And perhaps that's why fragrance in the Middle Ages was both beautiful and sad. Beautiful because it was hope, sad because it was false. In great cities, some people carried sweet fruits, small metal spheres engraved with ornate designs, filled with perfumed wax or powdered herbs. They called them pomanders. They hung them from their belts or held them in their hands like jewels. Each time they passed something foul, they lifted the pomander to their nose and inhaled deeply. It was both adornment and protection, because people believed perfume could block poisoned air, what they thought caused the plague. Some died still clutching those fragrant orbs. They were proof of faith, the belief that scent could save them from death, but scent never beat reality. Walk down a medieval street, and you'd understand. Fragrance was just a thin mist over the abyss of human odour. Amid the smoke, mud, blood and sweat, even a breath of mint could make someone believe that life still held a trace of beauty. And maybe that's why they kept carrying it, not to hide themselves, but to remind themselves that in a world that stank, people could still try to smell a little bit like hope. Public bathhouses once thriving, but later condemned as dens of sin, spreaders of disease, and eventually erased from Europe as if they had never existed. In earlier centuries, before fear took hold of humankind, bathhouses were the liveliest places in towns. They weren't just for washing the body, they were for warmth, for conversation, for chance encounters that changed lives. The elderly came to soothe their joints, the young came to laugh, merchants came to strike deals. They soaked in great wooden tubs, steam rising thick enough to blur the ceiling, laughter mingling with the sound of splashing water. In the dim light, oil lamps reflected off the vapour, looking like floating souls between worlds. But that was when the bathhouse was still a symbol of life. Later, it became a symbol of sin. When the plagues came, people began to see bathhouses differently. Water opens the pores, the physicians warned, and through them, poison enters. The church declared, to bear flesh among strangers is sinful. The devil dances in warm water. And so, what was once a place of joy turned into a pit of vice and disease. Rumours spread faster than steam. People whispered that demons hid in the mist, slipping into the skin of bathers to infect them or lure them into lust. Soon, bathhouses were shut down, some even burned. All that remained were relics, cracked yellow tubs, splintered walls, and the memory of a time when people still believed in water. But not everyone accepted it. Some still bathed in secret, at night, when the city slept. In the dark they lit fires, boiled water, and poured their fear and exhaustion out with each bucket of heat. The air filled with the mingled scents of smoke, wood, flesh, and steam, something between sin and salvation. One woman said the last real bath she ever took was in an old bathhouse at the foot of the hill, a place later destroyed because demons lived there. She said the water was so warm it made her cry. "I felt human," she whispered, before they told me never to bathe again. After the bans, rivers became the only places left to bathe and the most dangerous. People went there not just to wash, but to secretly feel what they had lost. Some were caught and punished for exposing flesh before God. Bathing became rebellion. Generations later, people still told stories of secret bathhouses, hidden rooms beneath houses, known only to a few. There, they boiled water over fire, mixed in herbs or oil, and bathed in silence. No one spoke. They knew discovery meant exile, or worse, being branded heretic. Yet they did it anyway, because the body needed what faith denied. They bathed not to be clean, but to remember what it felt like to be alive. And perhaps, in those stolen breaths of steam, between darkness and damnation, they found a flicker of freedom. The bathhouse was once where people met through skin, laughter, and warmth, not through layers of cloth and smell. When it vanished, Europe lost part of its soul. People forgot the feeling of water on their skin, the relief of shedding life's dust. What replaced it was fear. Fear of sin, fear of sickness, fear of their own bodies. Children born afterward didn't even know what a bathhouse was. They only heard stories that water kills. They grew up in a world where smoke replaced water, sweat replaced cleansing, and cleanliness became suspicious. An old record from Florence tells that when the last bathhouse closed, townsfolk gathered around it in silence. No one protested, no one spoke. Only an old man with a broom swept the tiled floor and sighed. From now on, we'll never smell real people again. Simple words, yet heavy with loss. To him, the smell of real people was the smell of water, of warmth, of life. When the bathhouses disappeared, all that remained was the smell of ash and fear. Looking back from this century, it might seem absurd. How could they fear water, the very source of life? But remember, they lived in a time with no answers. When plague killed millions and no one knew why, people clung to anything that made them feel control, even if it was wrong. They believed closing the baths would save them. And so, warmth became sin, laughter became forbidden. The bathhouse, that symbol of humanity, vanished, leaving behind a Europe steeped in fear, filth, and isolation. Yet perhaps, in every curl of hearth smoke, in every human breath thick with stench, there still lingered a memory of warm steam, of laughter shared in the old baths. And that memory, though buried under centuries of dust, still reminds us there was once a time when people were not afraid of their own bodies. After the Black Death, people believed that water opened the pores, letting poisoned air seep inside. It was a belief that haunted Europe for centuries after the catastrophe of 1347, when the Black Death swept through like a storm, killing tens of millions in just a few years. It didn't just steal lives, it twisted how humans saw the world. From then on, everything once associated with purity became dangerous, and water, once a symbol of life, became the symbol of death. They said that, in the years after the plague, whole villages would shudder if someone suggested taking a bath. "Do you want to open your skin and let the poison in?" That was what people whispered to each other, half afraid, half convinced. They believed the plague came from poisoned air, what they called miasma, an invisible vapor floating in the wind. When you bathed, your pores opened, and the miasma would slip into your body, killing you from within. That belief ran so deep that even the educated supported it. Physicians, priests, and nobles all advised avoiding water as one would avoid death. The survivors of the Black Death became paranoid because they had seen the cleanest people die first. They remembered nurses wiping down the sick, then collapsing themselves days later. In their minds, bathing meant dying. A Venetian record once said, "He who lets water touch his skin opens the door to death." So, for years after the plague, bathhouses were abandoned, wells sealed, and the very act of touching water became taboo. People changed their daily habits. They wiped themselves with cloth, smoked their skin over fire to close the pores, and burned herbs in their rooms to purify the air. When someone fell ill, instead of washing them, they wrapped them tightly in blankets so no more poisoned air could enter. In some regions, laws even forbade bathing after sunset, believing night air carried the most deathly vapors. That fear was passed from mother to child, like instinct. A mother warned her son, "You may be dirty, but never let water touch your skin. Water kills." The boy believed her, growing up among sweat and smoke, never knowing the feeling of warm water on his body. That generation lived, loved, and died in fear of water, to the point that if someone admitted to bathing in a river, they were seen as reckless, even foolish. But the fear wasn't just superstition. It was the trauma of an age haunted by death. When no one understood what caused the plague, people needed something tangible to blame. And water, visible, touchable, became the perfect scapegoat. They said the stench from the dead had poisoned the rivers, that death itself lived in the streams. So avoiding water wasn't just about fear of sickness, it was about fear of spirits. In parts of Germany, people believed every drop of water held the soul of a drowned man, ready to drag you down if you touched it. No one bathed at night, no one even stepped in puddles after rain. They lived closed off, avoiding rivers, avoiding rain, avoiding what once nourished them. In cities, windows were sealed with vinegar-soaked cloth to block poisoned air. They believed vinegar and smoke could protect them, and so the smells of vinegar, smoke, and the human body mixed together, becoming the scent of survival. Meanwhile, merchants who sold herbs and spices grew rich. Everyone wanted something to mask the smell of death, something to make them believe the air was safe. A small vial of perfume could buy a sack of grain. Cleanliness, once a mark of civility, became a dangerous luxury. Can you imagine such a reversal? A world where people boasted, "I haven't bathed in a year." A place where water was no longer salvation but a curse. In Paris, water sellers had to swear their supply came from sources untainted by the breath of death. In England, there was even an old prayer, "Lord, keep my skin from water and the poisoned wind." It was recited as a spell of protection, especially during plague season. Some were so terrified that they sealed their wells, covered their buckets, refusing to let deadly vapor rise from the water inside their homes. They chose thirst over cleanliness. In that world, fear lived in every breath. A man would flinch at a drop of rain falling from the roof, as if it carried sickness. A woman would snatch her child away from a puddle, screaming, pale with terror. The child cried, not understanding but remembered. Water was forbidden. And so, fear multiplied through generations. Bathing, the simplest act of being human, became a forbidden ritual. Water, the source of life, became the emblem of death. People covered themselves in dust, sweat, and smoke, calling it protection. But deep down, they knew they were no longer living like humans, they were hiding from death. At night, when cold mist crept over the fields, you could imagine them sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, eyes stinging from smoke, still afraid. Not of plague, but of a single drop of water. Something once blessed by God had become a curse no one dared to wash away. And that is how an entire civilization fell into an age of smell, of dust, and of fear, all born from one terrible belief, that water no longer saved, but killed. Instead of bathing, they changed their undergarments, calling it cleansing of the soul. It sounds strange now, but in the world of the Middle Ages, where water was seen as dangerous, changing one's underclothes was elevated to a ritual of almost religious meaning. People believed that while the body could be dirty, the soul still needed renewal. And the way to do that wasn't by washing with water, but by changing the layer closest to the skin, the one that absorbed sweat, dust, and sin. When they removed it, they believed they were shedding the old, the sinful, the unclean part of themselves, and wearing something newer in spirit. In small villages, this act usually happened seasonally. Winters were too cold to undress, so they waited until spring, when the sun was warm enough to change without fear of illness. And that moment, to them, was as sacred as baptism. A mother would lay out a new garment, often just an old piece of linen patched together on the bed, fumigating it over the hearth smoke to cleanse it with fire. Then she'd help her child remove the old undergarment. Stiffened against the skin, darkened with use, it smelled too heavy for even smoke to mask. When the fabric finally peeled away, everyone sighed. Not just from relief, but from the feeling that something inside had been purified. They didn't think they were removing sweat, they believed they were removing sin. And as they put on the new layer, they felt happy, a simple happiness, born from the belief that their soul was fresh again, even if their skin wasn't. Monks took it even further. In monasteries, bathing was forbidden as an act of the flesh, but changing underclothes became a form of penance. Monks did it not to smell better, but to strip away sin each time it clung to the soul. With every change, they whispered a short prayer. Lord, cleanse me of the dust of the world. They believed the undergarment, being closest to the flesh, was where temptation and sin were trapped. When replaced, the soul became lighter, closer to God. Some records tell that in certain monasteries, the undergarments of the dead were washed in ashes, smoked with incense to purify them, and then given to new initiates. A cycle of cloth and soul. But for ordinary people, the act was less holy, more practical, yet still emotional. In villages steeped in odour, the rare act of changing clothes felt like rebirth. They said that when spring came, the village had a kind of day of changing, not official, but everyone knew. The whole community washed clothes, burned straw, and hung garments along fences for the wind to carry away the smell. No one spoke of it, but everyone felt lighter. Children laughed. Adults hung their old clothes to dry, watching them sway like the passing of a year. The old garments, dirty, thick, sometimes crawling with lice or eggs, were thrown away or cut into rags. That night the village smelled different smoke, fresh cloth and wind. In the small wooden houses, people sat around the fire, brushing their hands across clean fabric, smiling softly, as if they'd done something good. An old man said, "No need to bathe. A clean shirt means a clean heart." It sounded simple, but it reflected an entire belief that the body didn't matter, the soul did. Cleanliness wasn't on the skin, but in the act of renewal. And so, the undergarment became a bridge between flesh and faith. Some believed that dying in a clean one would help the soul reach heaven faster. That's why many asked their families to change their clothes before death, not for comfort, but to depart clean. One old woman said, "When my husband died, I changed his shirt. I burned the old one. I didn't want sin to follow him." Small actions, but full of faith in symbolic salvation. In cities, the wealthy kept the same custom, but more elegantly. They had many layers of soft linen, scented with herbs. Each change was accompanied by burning resins, as if performing a ritual. Some noble women even boasted of changing monthly, calling it a mark of piety, not luxury. In a French noble's diary from the 15th century, one line read, "I change my linen so my heart won't gather dust." To modern ears, it sounds absurd, but to them, it made perfect sense. The body could stink, but if the mind was renewed, they felt peace. It was how they coped with guilt and helplessness in a filthy world. They couldn't clean the body, so they purified the soul instead. When you imagine a medieval person changing their shirt, don't picture something mundane. Picture a ritual. Firelight flickering, smoke curling, wind brushing through cloth, and a quiet sigh as the new fabric touched skin. That was the rare moment they felt clean, not because they washed, but because they believed they'd left their darkness behind. And maybe, in that world of odour and fear, the belief in cleansing the soul through linen was the only way they could still feel a little holy amid all the dirt of the earth. Sweat mixed with dust, itching, insects living in the fabric. Yet people still worked, still loved, still gave birth. That's what made the Middle Ages both terrifying and miraculous amid stench, filth, and hardship. People still lived, still laughed, still longed. Every day, they woke when the sky was still misty, bodies sticky, skin cracked, hair matted like rope. Yet they went to the fields, lifted their tools, and chatted as if nothing was wrong. They no longer knew what clean meant, and maybe that's why they no longer felt miserable. Their bodies had merged with the earth, with the smell of grass, with sweat and dust, becoming part of the world around them. Every swing of the hoe, every drop of sweat was proof of humanity's incredible adaptability. Though unbathed, itchy, and wrapped in reeking clothes, they kept living. On their skin, lice and fleas crawled as if they were companions. Those tiny creatures hid in seams of clothing, in hair, in bedding, biting and itching through the night. People scratched until they bled, then went back to sleep, because there was no other choice. They'd grown so used to it, they treated it as normal. An old woman once said, "If I stop itching, I'll worry maybe God's taken my skin away." It sounds funny, but it's true. They'd lived with discomfort so long, it had become an old friend. In the house, bedbugs hid in straw mattresses and wooden cracks, crawling out at night. Children scratched their heads, hair tangled, yet they laughed and ran. They didn't know what clean meant, so they didn't see dirty. Adults endured with quiet acceptance. Some nights, the whole family sat by the fire, everyone scratching, the sound of nails on skin mixing with crackling wood, a strange symphony of a world without water. But don't think they only endured. Amid the filth, they still loved, still touched, still cared. Each other's smell didn't drive them apart, it made them feel close. A man could hold his wife wearing a wool tunic unwashed for 3 months, kiss her hair that smelled of smoke and sweat, and still find her beautiful. To him, that wasn't foul, that was the scent of the one he loved. In that world, a hug carried no perfume, but it carried warmth. They loved with primal tenderness, surrounded by the smell of earth, of smoke, of human life. You might not believe it, but children born in that world still lived, still grew, still carried the resilience of an entire era. That harsh environment, filthy, smoky, full of bacteria, forged them stronger than ever. They didn't fear dirt, or stench, or dust. They only feared hunger, cold, and loss. Dirt wasn't an enemy, it was armor. In long afternoons, farmers returned home, sweat dried on their necks, a crust of dust on their skin like powder. They wiped their faces with vinegar or a rag dampened in ash water, then sat to eat. A simple meal, dry bread, vegetable soup, maybe salted meat. They ate with their hands, talked, laughed, human scent blending with food, ash and wine. No clean towels, no washing water, yet laughter filled the room. In the small village, evenings were when people felt closest. They told stories, wove baskets, mended clothes, or sang. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and wine, the smell of life. Maybe because they lived inside the smell, they felt life differently through breath, through touch, through laughter. When a baby was born, the mother had no clean cloth or warm water. She wrapped the child in old fabric, passed it through smoke to cleanse the sin. The baby grew up, breathing the scent of smoke and milk, of people and earth, the scent of the real world. It didn't know perfume or soap, but it knew that its mother's scent was safety. For medieval people, life wasn't tied to cleanliness, it was tied to warmth. And they lived that way, completely dirty, yet deeply human. On summer nights, the village stench could be smelled from the road. But inside, there was music, laughter, song. Someone was proposing, someone was giving birth, someone had come back from war. Their skin was greasy, their hair clumped, their clothes foul, yet their hearts beat. Their blood ran hot, their eyes still shone. They didn't need water to love, nor cleanliness to live. Filth became proof of existence. Smell became the voice of humanity. In that world, if you got close, you'd notice something strange. Even stench had layers, top notes of sweat, middle notes of smoke, base notes of earth and wind. And within those layers was a story, the story of people who refused to surrender. So don't pity them. For though itchy, though living among lice and dust, they still loved, still laughed, still bore, and raised the next generation. In that smell, there was pain. Yes, but also a simple joy, the joy of surviving one more day. Scent became a marker of class. Nobles smelled sweet, peasants smelled strong. In the Middle Ages, where everyone lived inside a cloud of odor, smell wasn't just a sensation, it was a language. It told you who someone was, where they lived, whether they held power. Walking through the market, a single breath could tell you who was the servant, who was the master. The smell of sweat, smoke, and soil belonged to the poor. The scent of roses, amber, and musk that was the signature of power. In a world where bathing was a luxury, fragrance wasn't for cleanliness, but for status. Amid the crowds, nobles strode in heavy layers of embroidered silk, silver-threaded sleeves glinting, surrounded by clouds of resin perfume imported from the east. When they passed, no one needed to look. One whiff was enough to know this was someone with money, with privilege. They lived in stone houses, with servants to change their clothes daily, fumigating rooms with incense and aromatic resins. They never left home without a scented pouch or a silver pomander filled with herbs. They believed fragrance was an invisible armor, not just masking their bodies, but the distance between them and the poor. Inside palaces, perfume was part of ceremony. Ladies soaked their hair in rose water, rubbed their hands with oils, and sprayed their gowns with mixtures of pine resin, amber, and spirits. One noblewoman once said, "I don't need to bathe, I only need to smell good." And indeed, scent was their most elegant attire. That smell made them feel different. Higher, cleaner, though beneath it, they were as filthy as everyone else. They were simply dirty in a more sophisticated way. The peasants, meanwhile, lived in the smells of earth, manure, sweat, and smoke. Those odours clung to them, proof that they belonged to the lower world. When nobles passed through a village, they wrinkled their noses and covered their faces, while the peasants bowed their heads. Between them was not only a gap of wealth, but of scent. During ceremonies, the divide was even clearer. The church was thick with incense, the smell of resin mingling with sacramental wine, masking the odour of people. Those sitting near the altar, the nobles, smelled fragrant. Those in the back, crowded, smoky, sweaty, smelled harsh. No one spoke of it, but everyone felt the boundary in every breath. Smell became a way for society to label its people. A maid bringing food into her master's room carried the smell of the kitchen, ash, firewood, grease. Her scent made him frown, though he wasn't cleaner himself. But he paid to smell good, and she didn't. Thus, the right to smell pleasant became a privilege of class. The higher one's rank, the stronger their perfume, and the farther they drifted from reality. Those below, no matter how they tried, could never hide their true scent. A saying spread among villagers: "A poor man who smells sweet is a liar." In that world, perfume didn't just signal wealth, it reeked of deceit. The peasants looked at the nobles with envy and suspicion. They whispered, "They smell like flowers, but inside, they rot like corpses." Smell became a symbol of hypocrisy. Meanwhile, the upper class believed fragrance proved virtue, a divine mark of being chosen. Some priests even preached that the scent of the righteous differed from that of sinners. Some believed it so deeply that, before death, they anointed their bodies with perfume, to smell sweet when entering heaven. And so, smell became part of the soul itself. But the hierarchy of scent reached beyond class. It touched love. A nobleman would never marry a woman who smelled human, no matter how beautiful she was. Fragrance belonged to those raised in silk. The strong smell of sweat belonged to those who toiled. In folk tales, scent even became magic. Princesses exuded floral fragrance, while servants carried the smell of mud. Smell didn't just separate people, it defined their worth. Yet sometimes, those two worlds collided. A soldier returned from war, sitting in the perfumed streets, carrying the scent of earth, blood, and life. Nobles avoided him, but some looked with envy, because in that raw human odour there was truth, experience, existence. They smelled refined, but false. He smelled foul, but real. And that was the paradox of the Middle Ages. Stench meant life, while sweetness often masked death. As night fell, you could picture it in the castle. Expensive perfumes floated in the candlelight, while outside, in small wooden homes, smoke, sweat, and soil blended into a rough symphony of survival. Two worlds, one fragrant, one foul, yet both human. And if you asked someone back then whether they'd rather smell good or stay alive, they'd answer without hesitation, "I choose life. Even if it stinks, it's real." Once or twice a year, during festivals, people were allowed to bathe in the river, a moment both joyous and terrifying. That rare day felt like a great ritual, where people rediscovered the feeling of water while wrestling with the inherited fear of generations. All year, They lived in the smell of humans, in smoke and dust, believing water carried disease and demons. But when festival season arrived, usually in summer or early autumn, the church permitted the cleansing of the body to honor God, and the whole village gathered by the river. The sight was both chaotic and sacred. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, stood on the bank, hesitant, as if facing an abyss. The water shimmered under the sun. The wind carried the scent of wet grass, moss, and river smells unfamiliar to them. Someone stepped in, toes touching the cold surface, then quickly pulled back, heart pounding. They were afraid not just of the chill, but of the belief that a single wrong breath could let poison air seep into their blood. But the laughter of children, the distant ringing of church bells, and the call to wash and be forgiven gave them courage. And so, the first person stepped fully into the river. A small splash echoed. Everyone watched, holding their breath. Nothing happened. The person smiled, scooped up water, and splashed their face, then another, and another. Soon the riverbank filled with laughter, water flying, voices echoing as if the whole world had been unlocked after years of fear. Yet if you looked closer, you'd see how foreign every movement was. They didn't scrub their bodies as we do today. They merely scooped and sprinkled, as though a touch was enough. Some bent down to sip a drop, then immediately spat it out, half bravado, half test of the water's safety. And when the sun set, wet bodies climbed back onto shore, shivering, smiling through eyes still full of worry. Joy mixed with fear that was their truth. An old woman whispered, "If I live through tonight, perhaps God has forgiven me." For the medieval mind, bathing wasn't about cleaning the body, it was a test of faith. In some regions, river bathing became a ritual tied to harvest feasts, Easter, or weddings. The bride and groom would step into the water together, washing their faces before starting a new life. They believed the river carried away old sins and brought blessings, but even in joy, fear lingered. A cold gust of wind could send the whole crowd scrambling ashore, wrapping themselves in cloth, muttering prayers. And if someone fell ill after the ritual, the village took it as a bad omen, proof that the water was tainted by sin. So in the years that followed, fewer dared to bathe again. The fear turned bathing into a legend. Children grew up hearing, "Your mother once bathed when the sky was still blue." To them, water was for drinking, not touching. But to the elders, the memory of that river festival was one of their brightest. Some said they could still feel the cool water racing across their skin like a shock, awakening parts of themselves that had forgotten what clean felt like. It was strange and familiar at once, like being born again. In villages near the sea, the ritual grew grander. They called it the Day of Water. At dawn, the entire village would wade into the waves, praying, singing, believing that salt water could drive out evil. But some died from the cold afterward, and fear grew again. They said, "Water saves only those God chooses." And so, though the festivals continued, fewer people truly bathed. They merely scooped water, touched it to their foreheads, and left. That act was a promise they wanted to be clean, but only half dared. For them, bathing wasn't hygiene, but a sacred negotiation between man and faith. And so, every bath became a memory, not because their bodies were washed, but because their souls were tested. At night, those who had bathed sat around fires, skin still damp, the smell of smoke blending with the scent of river. They spoke of the feeling of water on flesh, of the lightness, and of the fear that followed. One man said, "I feel cold, but my heart is warm." That sentence held it all. Water was both friend and foe, salvation and danger. In that world, bathing was a luxury, but also a dream. They could not bathe often, but when allowed, they did it with all their faith. They trembled with fear, yet still stepped into the current, because deep down, everyone remembered the body once belonged to water. Perhaps, in that moment when they bent down and splashed a handful across their faces, smoke, sweat, dust and fear all vanished for just an instant. And in that brief second, they were truly human again, not dirty, not sinful, just a person in the water, rediscovering a feeling lost to centuries. They believed a clean soul mattered more than a clean body. God sees the heart, not the skin. That was what priests preached every week in the church. surrounded by the scent of incense and the odour of humanity mingling together. In the Middle Ages, when bathing was seen as sinful, religion wrapped that fear in holiness and turned it into a virtue. You don't need to be clean on the outside, they said, as long as your heart isn't dirty. And so, filth was dressed in sanctity. God doesn't care if your skin has mud, the priest said. He only cares if your heart is pure. The people listened and felt comforted. They didn't bathe not because they were poor, not because they were afraid, but because they were faithful. They believed water could wash the body, but only prayer could cleanse sin. A man, after a long day of work, instead of washing his hands, knelt to pray for forgiveness. To him, dirty hands were proof of labour, and only the soul needed purification. That belief made society at peace with filth, because they no longer saw it as filth. They saw it as natural, humble, even moral. Cleanliness became suspicious, because it hinted at vanity, at flesh, at sin. In monasteries, monks were taught that caring too much for the body was a sign of pride. Anyone who tended their skin was straying from God. One monk wrote in his journal, "I let dust settle on my skin as a reminder that this flesh will return to ash." To them, the smell of sweat was a mark of devotion, the smell of perfume, temptation. They lived in damp darkness, prayed in the scent of people, and believed that was how their souls shone brighter. Ordinary folk lived under those sermons every day. They heard priests speak of the sinful nature of flesh and the holiness of decay, and slowly came to believe that bathing was an indulgence offensive to God. A mother would tell her child, "Don't worry if you're dirty, as long as your heart is clean." That saying passed from generation to generation until it became law. A child would grow up never knowing the smell of soap, but reciting prayers asking to cleanse the soul through faith. In churches, incense smoke hung thick, masking the smell of sweat, dirt, garbage, and smoke. All that existed outside was perfumed and called sacred. But if you sniffed closely, you'd know it was the same. The only difference was the meaning people gave to it. The stench, when paired with prayer, became the scent of devotion. There's a story from Normandy about a young priest once accused by villagers because he bathed too often. He believed the body was also a gift from God and should be kept clean to honour him. But the villagers thought otherwise. "He bathes to seduce women," they said. "A man of God shouldn't smell good." One night, they drove him out of the village, saying he had betrayed the faith. In that world, cleanliness was dangerous. It reminded people they could control their own bodies, while the church wanted them to believe only God could. Dirt, therefore, became the mark of obedience. The dirty but devout were loyal, the clean and proud were sinners. And so, Europe lived with that paradox for centuries. When you step into a medieval church, imagine the smell: thick incense, sweetness mixing with the musk of human skin, sweat, greasy hair, and mouldy cloth. It wasn't just the scent of people, it was the scent of belief, the conviction that the soul was purified while the flesh decayed. Altars went unwiped, statues unwashed, because dust itself was seen as sacred time. Some statues of Christ turned black from soot, but people called it the touch of faith. In convents, young nuns were taught to avoid mirrors, for reflection revealed the body, and the body was the root of temptation. They washed their hair with ash, wiped their skin with vinegar cloths, and called it the washing of the soul. To them, water did not clean, repentance did. In small villages, when someone fell ill, they didn't bathe them. They summoned a priest to pray and sprinkle holy water. Just a few drops were enough to cleanse the soul before death, even if the body remained filthy. When someone died, they were wrapped in rough linen, unwashed, unbathed for fear of opening the door to demons. They believed God saw within, not without. And strangely, that belief brought peace. They lived in mud, in smell, in itching discomfort, yet their hearts were calm, because they believed their souls were still white. To modern minds, that's ignorance. But to the medieval world, it was survival. Because when water was forbidden, when cleanliness became sin, faith was all they had left to hold on to. God sees the heart, not the skin. It wasn't just doctrine, it was comfort. It made the poor feel not lesser, the sick feel not filthy, and those afraid of water believed they were still pure in their own way. And perhaps, It was that faith that kept them alive among the stench, the smoke, and the plagues that killed millions. They still believed that though their flesh rotted, their souls remained fragrant before God. By the Renaissance, perfume, powder, and baths had returned, but only for the rich. After centuries of living in the darkness of human odour, Europe began to awaken. The light of knowledge, art, and the desire to live beautifully flared across the continent. Paintings of the human body appeared, Greek statues were sculpted anew, and for the first time in hundreds of years, people looked at their own flesh without disgust. They wanted to be clean, to smell good, to live like the gods in their paintings. But like everything else in that era, this awakening wasn't for everyone. Only the nobles, the rich, the educated, the powerful could afford the luxury called cleanliness. They rebuilt baths, no longer public houses like before, but private sanctuaries hidden deep inside palaces, adorned with marble, roses, and candlelight. They didn't bathe daily, but enough to separate themselves from the poor. Gleaming bronze tubs, crystal bottles of perfume from Italy, France, or the Ottoman Empire, and fine white linen towels all became new symbols of civilization. In Florence, wealthy merchants flaunted their baths as they did paintings by Leonardo. Water was no longer danger, it was art. They soaked in warm milk baths, scattered rose petals, rubbed almond oil on their skin, and perfumed themselves. But their cleanliness wasn't about hygiene, it was about beauty. They didn't want to look dirty, but they still feared touching water too long. Some only wet-wiped instead of soaking, believing one should only touch water gently to stay healthy. Bathing became a ritual of aesthetics, not survival. In the great cities, scent returned to glory, but not as a mask for filth. Now it was a declaration of power and style. Perfume bottles, crafted with art and blended from flowers, resins, and rare oils, became the gifts of nobles. They said some ladies refused to step outside until they smelled like a garden in heaven. The aromas of rose, lavender, musk, and amber floated through palaces, coating everything in a seductive, false radiance. The poor, meanwhile, lived the same mud, sweat, and dust. They gazed through the city gates, inhaling the scent of feasts that smelled like another world. One old woman said, "They smell sweet because they have power. We stink because we have the earth." Bitter words, but true. While nobles bathed in milk and flowers, peasants still wiped themselves with vinegar and ash. The divide of smell was no longer just class, it was civilization and neglect. Yet amid the light of the Renaissance, new awareness of the human body began to stir. Scientific, not spiritual. Physicians trained in Italy and France started to see the body as a machine to be cared for, not confined. They encouraged bathing, fresh air, and saw cleanliness as health. But that wisdom hadn't yet reached everyone. The poor had no water, no tubs, no time to cleanse their souls with steam. To them, bathing was still a dream. Meanwhile, in the palaces, cleanliness became a form of display. Noble women painted their faces white, perfumed their entire bodies, and wrapped themselves in layers of silk so thick they could barely breathe. They were clean in the fashion of their age, clean on the surface, not in truth. One layer of powder, one layer of perfume, one layer of velvet hiding a body that still smelled human. The difference was, their scent was called refined. At the grand feasts of Versailles or Florence, people sprayed perfume on gloves, hair, even fans. When they spoke, they waved their fans to spread fragrance, as if scent had become the new language of status. A man could charm with words, but if he smelled of labour, he was vulgar. The Renaissance revived not only art, but also the idea of fragrance, though only for those who could afford it. The poor still carried the same scent as the centuries before: grass, sweat, smoke, and earth. They watched the world change from afar. Some said, if you walked through a Renaissance city, you could smell 2 layers above, perfume, below, garbage, sewage, and people. 2 worlds, sharing one breath. Yet within that same era, the seeds of true hygiene were planted. Scholars began studying disease, bacteria, and the necessity of cleanliness. They wrote books, gave lectures, and preached that the purity of the body reflects the clarity of the mind. They were mocked as eccentrics, but they paved the way for a new age, one where people dared to look at their own bodies, not with fear, but with reason. And so, from the Renaissance onward, Europe began to emerge from the age of smell, slowly but surely. Water returned to humankind, no longer poison, but salvation. Even if it was first reserved for the wealthy, it marked the beginning of a journey the whole world would follow. A journey to reclaim the lost bond between man and water, between cleanliness and life, between body and soul. And from those glittering marble tubs in the palaces, the idea of being fragrant to live began to replace being filthy to believe. You sit by the fire, the smell of your body blending with the scent of burning wood, and realize this is the smell of an entire era. Kitchen smoke curls around you, golden light flickers on the clay walls where black soot has clung for years. You hear the crackle of logs, the whistle of wind through the cracks, and in that moment you feel as though you're living in the 14th century. No soap, no clean water, only warmth, smoke, and people. The scent of smoke seeps into your hair, your skin, your clothes, mixing with the old sweat, the earth, the ash forming a fragrance that's both heavy and familiar. That smell is a fusion of life and time, of humanity and the world around it. It isn't pleasant, but it isn't alien either. It's reality. When you breathe deeply, you smell the old world, the creak of wooden wheels on dirt roads, the chatter of people in the market, the scent of dried fish, salted meat, tanned leather, and cheap wine. Each smell a note in the symphony of medieval life. And within that smell lies something strange. It doesn't just tell of filth, but of life. Every particle of scent is a trace of existence. Medieval people didn't have Chanel perfume or lavender body wash, but they had the raw scent of labor, of fear, of love, of survival. The smell of people, of fire, of earth. Those were the three fragrances of their world. You see an old man sitting across the fire. His beard is thick, his hair grey, his clothes heavy, his coat smoky. He doesn't even notice his own smell. To him, it's part of his body, like breath. His voice, rough and steady, drifts like wind through trees as he speaks of winters when snow covered the roof, and the whole family huddled by the fire for months without bathing, yet still felt safe, because the smoke kept them from sickness. The smell of smoke is the smell of God, he says. If you can smell smoke, it means you're alive. Beside him, a young woman holds her sleeping child, their sweat mingling with the warmth of the smoke. No one thinks it stinks. They feel peace. That's how they lived through scent. Smell wasn't something to hide from. It was something to believe in. They didn't fear human scent, because it was proof they were still here, still breathing in a world filled with darkness and death. That smell was the whisper of life, the voice of instinct, the one thing they could trust in an age where nothing else was certain. When you look around the wooden house, everything carries a scent. The table, the chairs, the straw bed, the earthen walls all soaked in the aroma of those who lived there. The whole room is an archive of human memory, stored in smell. If someone leaves, their scent lingers for weeks, months. It's how medieval people remembered each other, not by pictures, not by words, but by scent. The smell of a mother on her child's shirt, the scent of a husband on a blanket, the faint trace of the dead still clinging near the hearth. In a world without photographs, smell was the only proof of presence, and the last thing to remain after everything else had gone. The fire crackles, lighting every face in gold. Some close their eyes, leaning back, exhaling smoke as their scent merges with the air. Each breath a silent prayer. Keep me in this smell, for it is the smell of life. Outside, the wind sweeps across the fields, carrying the odour of horse dung, dry grass, and ashes from other homes. It all blends together, spreading through the village. If you stood there at midnight, you'd feel wrapped in a cloud of scent so dense it's almost tangible. That smell ties people to the earth. It's the thin line between life and death. Perhaps medieval people never truly thought they lived in filth, because they never knew what clean meant. To them, this was nature. They didn't live surrounded by smell, they lived inside it. And that smell, strong as it was, belonged to everyone, crossing class and creed. From kings in palaces to peasants in huts, each had their own scent, but together they formed the smell of an age. When you inhale deeply, you realize no perfume could ever imitate it. It's too real, too alive, too human. In the modern world, we call it stink. But in that medieval night, by the fire, it was the fragrance of warmth. As the old man nods off, the children curl in their blankets, and the flames lick the ceiling. The smell of smoke and humanity intertwines like two things that were never meant to be apart. And you standing outside time finally understand, if there is one scent that defines the Middle Ages, it isn't blood, or war, or death. It's this, the smell of the human body blended with burning wood. The smell of people living, struggling, loving, fearing, yet still sitting together by the fire, clinging to warmth in a cold world. That scent is the soul of an era, raw, heavy, human, unforgettable. History isn't always fragrant, but in that smell lies the true breath of humanity. That sentence feels like a closing line for an era we often view with disgust, yet if you listen closely, you'll realize it's a story of survival, of instinct, of human beings facing themselves with nothing left to hide behind. Smell, in the medieval world, wasn't something they avoided. It was something they lived with, bonded with, accepted, and sometimes even worshipped. It wasn't just the stench of the body. It was the language of time, the witness of a civilization both primitive and resilient. Every scent told a story. The smoke told of meals, the leather told of labor, the sweat told of fear and hope. Every person carried their own smell as an identity, something that could never be washed away. And even though we now bathe daily and wear expensive perfume, we can never recreate that human smell, the scent of real life, unpolished, unhidden. When looking back at history, modern people often laugh, they were so dirty. But perhaps it's us who've grown distant from nature. The medieval people lived among scents, but they could feel the soil, they knew the wind, they understood fire, and they listened to smell as if it were music. In their scent lived the sounds of ploughing, the lullabies, the sighs beside the hearth, the prayers in the chapel, and the heartbeat of real human life. Their smell was proof that they lived imperfectly, uncleanly, but completely. If history were a painting, then scent would be the hidden color we always forget. Every era has its own smell. The ink of the 18th century, the smoke and oil of the 19th, the plastic and metal of the 20th. But no smell was as real as that of the Middle Ages, the scent of humanity unindustrialized, still tethered to nature. It was the smell of closeness, of smoke and breath, of mud and blood, of love and death. It wasn't pleasant, but it was too honest to be fake. When you inhale, you're not just smelling history, you're feeling the life of millions who once walked this earth, who ate, worked, loved, and feared. Every dust mote in the medieval air once brushed against someone's skin that was the scent of humankind. And so, when we say, history isn't always fragrant, we're not mocking, we're admitting that truth sometimes reeks, sometimes suffocates, but is always worth smelling again. It's in the most unpleasant odors that we feel life's intensity the clearest. Imagine if we stripped the world of all its smells, left it sterile, polished, odorless, what would remain? A soulless existence. Smell, no matter how foul, is proof that humans are real, that we have bodies, weaknesses, sweat. And the medieval people, by not bathing, by living within their odors, left behind a sensory memory no era can recreate. They didn't know bacteria, they didn't know chemistry, but they knew endurance. They knew how to live amid hardship, how to find warmth in mud, how to love through smoke and sweat. And that's why they deserve remembrance, not because they stank, but because they were real. Today, when we walk into museums, staring at shining armor, intricate tapestries, ancient books, we only see the polished surface time has scrubbed clean. But imagine what lies beneath that shine, the smell of metal mixed with sweat, of horsehide, of people embedded in every fiber. History, if only seen, is half complete. You must smell it to understand it. Scent is the lingering soul of the past. And if you close your eyes, breathe in wood smoke, leather, and old cloth, you'll feel yourself pulled back to a time when people didn't fear dirt, only cold, didn't fear smell, only death. In that moment, you'll realize something simple, that humans, across centuries, have always been small creatures, just trying to live in a vast world. And smell is the evidence of that struggle, a battle without glory, only breath. As the fire in the wooden house fades and the smoke rises into the night, you sit quietly. The scent of people still clings to your clothes, the smoke still lingers in your hair, and you suddenly understand some things don't need to be fragrant to be beautiful. Some things only need to be real. And the smell of history, foul, heavy, haunting, remains to remind us that we once lived, once existed, once loved. It is the scent of humanity, of time, of ourselves. And when you take another deep breath, you'll smile, because no matter how much the world changes, one scent never fades: the smell of being human. If you're still here, it means your heart is beating in rhythm with the stories of the night. Hit subscribe and join me on the next journey where every shadow hides a secret waiting to be awakened. And now, dim the lights. Let your mind drift, and let sleep take you away. Sleep peacefully, because tonight, the world is still whispering.